Asher Richard IV stood at the entrance to the restaurant he had always associated with comfort and prestige. It was where million-dollar deals were made, secret agreements were negotiated, and dinners were often turned into news events. It was the place where the worlds of power, money, and fame intersected, and Asher, being one of the most famous men of his time, was not here for the first time. Tonight seemed no different from any other night. He had decided to spend his time at dinner where he planned to discuss a few upcoming projects. Dressed in a strict but stylish suit, Asher confidently crossed the threshold of the restaurant, expecting the usual respect and attention. However, things went wrong from the start. The hostess behind the counter, a young woman with a practiced smile, took one glimpse of him and without the slightest acknowledgement asked him to wait. Asher was surprised. Usually he was greeted with enthusiasm, instantly escorted to his favorite table. He looked around the room. The customers, mostly white, were leisurely enjoying their meals, while the staff served them with a smile. A few minutes passed. Asher was still standing at the counter, while the other guests who came later were already seated. Finally, the hostess turned to him.
"Sorry for the wait. Follow me."
Her voice was polite but lacked warmth. To Asher's surprise, he was seated at a table in the corner next to the kitchen, where the hum of dishes and the smells of food cooking created an uncomfortable atmosphere. He held back his irritation and turned to the waiter.
"Excuse me, but I usually sit by the window. Perhaps you could move me over there?"
The waiter, a young guy with a strained smile, replied,
"I'm sorry, but those tables are reserved tonight."
Asher noticed that a few tables by the window were vacant, and his irritation increased. However, he decided not to make a scene. He placed his order and tried to focus on his evening, but his thoughts kept returning to the situation. He knew that his face was one of the most recognizable in the country. His millions of followers followed his every move. His accomplishments became a symbol of success for many. And yet, here, in this restaurant, it was as if he had been robbed of that identity. When the waiter brought his order, Usher decided to discreetly ask,
I can't help but notice that I'm usually treated a little differently. Is everything all right?
The waiter faltered slightly.
"Of course, sir. We try to treat all our guests equally. If there's anything wrong, I can get the manager."
Asher nodded but declined the offer. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, though the feeling of discomfort never left him. The situation seemed to him not an accident, but something more, part of that invisible but tangible wall he'd faced all his life. As he left the restaurant, a plan was already brewing in his mind. He wasn't ready to let it go unheeded. Perhaps he would come back here again to figure out what was going on. For now, all he had to do was try to understand why, despite all his status and accomplishments, the world still looked at him through the prism of skin color. The next day, surfing social media over a cup of coffee, Asher was still thinking about what had happened at the restaurant. The thought that his experience could have been more than just an accident continued to bother him. He made the decision to go back there again, but this time with a friend, a man whose race could play an important role in uncovering the truth. That friend was Michael, a successful white businessman and a close acquaintance of Asher's. Michael understood his concerns and was willing to help.
"If you think it's worth looking into, I'm with you."
Michael said as Asher explained his plan.
"But are you sure you want to go for it?"
Yes,
Asher answered without hesitation.
I want to see if it's systemic or not.
In the evening, the two of them entered the restaurant again. This time, Asher watched closely to see everything that was going on. The hostess immediately smiled at Michael and greeted him as if he were an old friend. When it was Asher's turn, her tone changed. It became more formal, almost mechanical. They were seated at the best table by the window, but only because Michael insisted. Asher noticed how the staff showed more attention to Michael than to him, even though it was Asher who ordered. He also noticed the little things, how the waiter leaned closer to Michael, how he smiled at him and barely looked at Asher. After dinner, Asher approached the manager. He politely but firmly asked a question.
It seems to me that my friend and I were treated differently. Can you explain that?
The manager, a middle-aged man with a professional smile, answered evasively.
We are very sorry if you have that impression. We try to treat all our guests equally.
Usher felt a familiar sense of disappointment. He realized he wasn't going to get a straight answer, but now he had confirmation that his worries were not unfounded. As they left the restaurant, Michael turned to him.
You were right. It was obvious even to me. What are you going to do next?
I don't know yet,
Usher answered.
but I'm certainly not going to leave it.
Usher returned home, but his thoughts kept returning to the dinner at the restaurant. He couldn't shake the feeling that his identity was once again an excuse for prejudice. Sitting in his spacious office, surrounded by awards and photos with influential people, he felt helpless for the first time in a long time. He picked up his clipboard and began writing notes. He needed to express his feelings, to make sense of them. But words were hard to come by. How to explain to people what the constant invisible pressure was? How to convey that even success and fame can't completely protect against bias? Usher recalled other times in his life when he faced similar situations. On the set of one ad campaign, a producer told him that his image might be too specific for a general audience. Another time, business partners subconsciously questioned his professionalism despite his obvious accomplishments. He ran his hands over his face, trying to calm himself down. He wanted to believe that society was moving forward, but reality was a constant reminder of how deeply entrenched the stereotypes were. It seemed to him that his success had been a shield that was now cracked, exposing an old truth. Skin color still mattered. Mustering up the courage, Usher began writing a post on his blog. He wanted to share his story without blaming specific people, but showing how these small, seemingly small details add up to one big picture. He wrote, "Sometimes even those who have accomplished much are faced with reminders that our world is far from equal. These moments may not seem important to others, but they stay with me, making me think about how far we've come and how much more there is to do." He stopped, reread what he'd written, and clicked Save as Draft. He wasn't sure he was ready to publish it. Instead, he closed the tablet and got up to look out the window. The city glowed with lights, reminding him of his accomplishments, but there was still a feeling inside that his struggle wasn't over yet. A few days later, Usher decided to publish that very post. He posted it on his blog, accompanied by a picture of him sitting at a table by the window with a pensive expression on his face. The post quickly attracted attention, as he expected. Comments poured in one after another, but the reaction was not what he had hoped for. Hundreds of users supported Usher, sharing their stories of encounters with bias. However, there were also plenty of critical comments. "You're exaggerating too much. It's just dinner. You're successful and rich. Why would you complain? Can such trivial things really bother you?" Some even accused him of trying to make a big deal out of nothing. These comments hurt Usher more than he expected. He had always thought of himself as someone who could handle criticism. But this time it felt like confirmation that people didn't want to see the underlying problems. His thoughts went back to the restaurant, to the little things that were now a symbol of something bigger. That same evening, he received a call from Michael.
I saw your post. You know I'm with you. But you have to be prepared for the fact that not everyone will understand what you're talking about. Some people just don't want to believe it.
Usher nodded, though Michael couldn't see it.
Yeah, I know that. It's just that sometimes it presses harder than usual. I'm trying to make a difference, but I feel like I'm moving alone.
He realized that one post wasn't enough. The problem he faced wasn't personal, it was systemic. But the feeling that even his voice was going unheard, to a certain extent, was frustrating. Later that night, Usher decided he wasn't going to stop at one post. He began developing ideas for a campaign that could bring more attention to issues of racial inequality. He understood that change took time, but he was willing to fight for it, even if it meant overcoming criticism and misunderstanding. Several months had passed since Usher published his post about racism and bias. Despite all the attention he brought to the issue, the feeling of unresolution has only grown. While some people supported him and shared their own stories, others continued to insist that he was exaggerating or looking for problems where none existed. Usher spent this time reflecting, trying to figure out how he could use his influence to make a difference. He began participating in community discussions, speaking at conferences, and even partnered with several organizations that worked to combat racial stereotypes. But despite his efforts, the sense of progress was meager. Society seemed divided between those who saw a problem and those who preferred to ignore it. One evening, Usher once again decided to visit the very same restaurant. He entered with his usual confidence, but this time he noticed that something was different. The hostess greeted him with a wide smile and escorted him to one of the best tables by the window. The staff was gracious, the service impeccable. At first glance, it might have seemed like a victory. Inside Usher, however, there was an entirely different feeling. He realized that this change was only superficial. He was beginning to be recognized, perhaps because of the hype surrounding his post, or maybe because of fears of public scandal. But that didn't mean the problem had disappeared. Systemic biases couldn't be eliminated so easily. Sitting at the table, he looked out over the restaurant room. Everything seemed serene and harmonious here, but he knew there was a deeper truth behind this facade of well-being. These changes were not the result of consciously overcoming stereotypes, but merely a temporary reaction to pressure. When the waiter brought the bill, Usher thanked him and left the restaurant. As he walked outside, he stopped and looked around. This place, which had once been a symbol of prestige to him, was now associated with something more, a struggle that he knew would never fully end. Usher got in his car and headed home. He knew he had the resources, the platform, and the time to keep talking about what was important. But he also knew that change takes tremendous effort and patience. Sometimes he felt alone in this struggle, but that didn't stop him. The story of Usher Richard IV did not end with a happy ending. It remained open-ended, like the struggle against racism itself, which had no end in sight. But that was the point. He realized that true progress is not about instant victories, but about constantly moving forward despite obstacles.